I'm going to demonstrate some foam core and cardboard fabrication techniques. I'm going to show how to build this object. This is a bottle shape, bottle design, which we're going to use this technique for our class. It can be used for anything though. So the important part is some of these techniques for bending and scoring and cutting foam core and cardboard. So it could be used for kind of box designs, point of purchase displays, product. There's a whole series of different things that we could use this technique. I'm just showing this bottle design because it relates to what we're going to be doing in our class. So some of the materials that we're going to use, I use Elmer's glue, and we're going to use some masking tape, X-Acto knife with number 11 blades, and a pencil and a straight edge. And I cut up some paper towels. I usually keep these handy because I get glue on my fingers or on the object we're making, so I rub that off. So I keep those handy. So what we need to do, or what I did for this project, is I laid out the parts, what these are going to look like. So I did derive this from a 3D file, and I did my orthographic projections. So obviously this is the front and the back of the object, and all these other parts here are what I call formers. They're pieces that we're going to glue on the inside to create all these curves. So this is a pretty strong part. So by doing all that and curving the foam core around that and using these formers, we can really get a very nice controlled shape. We can get all these beautiful curves really nice and clean. So of course with a bottle design, it's a blow molded process. So with molding, obviously there would be radiuses on these corners and some of these surfaces would be arced. So when we're imitating bottle designs out of foam core and cardboard, we're compromising some of those curves. But we can get the majority of the design intent for some of these. So it's good to look at volumetrics, how it might feel. We might want to mock up some of these bottles if we're making a kit to see how it's going to fit, or see how multitudes might work in a display perhaps. So this is all preliminary before a design is actually actualized and we have the molded parts. So it is a bit of a compromise. Some of these designs, when you get more involved with compound curves, are much better done in foam. And I'm going to do another tutorial in sculpting bottle shapes out of foam. But this technique is also very useful for different types of objects. So once we get these all laid out, we're going to glue these all together, and I'm going to demonstrate how that works. So this is just a printout, and I use a repositionable spray mount, and I spray that and I adhere this to the foam core. The foam core we're going to be using is an 1/8 inch foam core. So there's two different thicknesses. There's 1/8, well, several thicknesses, but the smaller ones are 1/8 and 3/16. So small objects like this, I like to use the 1/8. It's quite a bit thinner and it's easier to work with smaller objects. But when we get involved with larger objects like point of purchase displays or large boxes or even imitating case bound structures, sometimes I'll use the 3/16 and it works out really well. So we're using 1/8 for this. So I use the repositional spray mount and I spray the line work on there and then cut that out. So I've started cutting out some of these pieces just to expedite this a little. So I had these two pieces here. So all these internal lines here are going to be partial cuts. We're going to cut partially through the foam core, through the top layer of the paper and into the foam, and then not into the bottom. So I had cut this piece out already, and I peeled off the paper and I transferred my center lines on there. So after we create all these perfs on the inside, this material will more easily arc. So we can bring that around. And when we glue our formers on the inside, we can hold this shape. So this is nice and smooth now, and I didn't cut through to the bottom side, so we can get this nice curved shape. So I'm just flexing that to encourage that to curve a little bit, and I'm going to cut out the rest of these pieces so we can demonstrate some of that. So these partial cuts can be a little challenging. It takes a little practice. So I like to do these partial cuts through the material before I cut out the profiles. I like to be able to just blend right off the shape and get nice clean cuts. If I cut the profile first, it's a little challenging to get it started, and I don't want to break through. I want to start over here and then come through and to the other side and make sure I don't go all the way through. So this can take a little practice. I'm just going to poke that in just a little bit. So I am partially cutting through. I'm just cutting through the top piece of the paper and then not through the bottom side. So in cutting these profiles by hand, it's very important that we try to keep the blade perpendicular to the surface. We want those edges to be as clean and straight and 90 degrees. So this takes a little bit of practice. We don't want to lean the blade towards one side. We all have a natural tendency to do that. So it takes a little practice. So what I like to do is try to arc my arm and not force my hand to come around like this, because it can start tearing the foam and it can be very inconsistent. So it's a nice, easy, I like to stand up when I do this, and I just run this blade, and I'm not going all the way through. I'm just doing a partial to get started, and then I'll come back. I'm really trying to keep that blade straight up. And I'm coming to here. So I'm going to stop right here. I'm going to turn the board and try to keep this arc with the natural bend of my arm. I'm taking it slow on this first path to stay right on my line work. So I'm coming over because I had done this side already. So I'm just going to work on this side. So now I can go a little quicker because I have that path has been started. So I'm kind of using that first cut as a guide to bring this around. So since it's 1/8 inch thick, should be able to do it in 2 passes. But there's nothing wrong with taking multiple passes and taking your time so we get a nice clean cut. Okay, so that's good. Got those 2 parts out. So on my construction work here, I have these center lines, and that's where these formers are going to be glued in. So we want to hang on to that information. I'm going to peel this paper off, so we're going to lose that. So what I do is I just make little tick marks over here on the side so we can transfer that information to the foam core. We're going to need to know where these are. We want to know where these are. So when we glue the formers in there, they'll stay together. So since this was glued on with the spray mount, we should be able to pull these off relatively easy. I'm just going to pull up these corners. Oops, pulling up the paper. We don't want to pull up the paper on the foam core, because we're relying on that paper on the foam core to help with our curve. Oops, I got a couple of, some of this does stick a little bit too much. Here we go. So I have these marks, so I'm just going to transfer that little mark to the surface here so I can see where that is going to be. So now we want to draw these lines. We need to know where these are. This will guide us when we start gluing in our formers on the inside. Okay. So there is a center line here. I'm only going to need that on the one, because when I glue the other one on, I won't need that. So what we can do is take this and sort of kind of encourage this to flex without folding. We don't want to fold. We want this to be nice and clean. So I'm just going to get that to bend a little bit, because when I glue that to the formers, it's going to want to expand, but we're going to use the tape to hold that. So I just want to encourage that to bend a little bit without folding those. Be very careful not to fold that. We're just getting that in like this. Okay, so those 2 are ready. Now the rest of this is pretty straightforward. These are the formers that are going to go right up the middle, and you'll see how they work. So I have it all laid out, and I have this little space in here where the material is going to be removed, so the curved formers will fit on the inside. So this is pretty straightforward. When I have all these lined up like this, I like to cut all of these parts, all of these lines first, and then I trim out the whole piece. It's just a little quicker, a little easier to go instead of cutting out each one individually. So by doing this, we don't have to measure all these little parts. Now, sometimes when I'm discovering a shape and I don't know exactly where I'm going, sometimes I will cut the foam core as I'm designing and building, because I'm not sure how things are going to work out. Here I have it completely planned out, and I made one. So we can emphasize the whole foam core fabricating techniques, and I'm not emphasizing the design process as much. But of course, this is all part of the design process. Discovering these shapes, learning, working with them, seeing how they feel. Okay, so I have all those cuts. Now all I have to do is run these cuts all at the same time. Again, I'm trying to keep that blade straight up. We'll see how I do. It is a challenge. Okay, I got it stuck there. Okay. So I didn't run those through. I should have done that instead of tearing. So I'm just going to go on the back here. Let's get those. I could have run through a little bit further. So now I'm looking at this, and you can see this is a little bit crooked here, slightly crooked. This one's pretty good. So not bad. Sometimes that can get in the way, and we'll see how everything lines up when we do that. So these we don't need. So these are going to be glued next to these other parts, which I had started to cut out. So we're going to glue this to the inside, and then these parts are going to be glued this way inside. So we don't need to hold on to any of these centers. We have the centers here, so when we glue these together, we're okay. So we can peel off the paper on these, and I don't need to transfer these center lines because we have this all lined up. So these, we can take the paper off. Same technique. We're going to cut this arc nice and easy, but I don't want to force my arm. I'm going to move the foam core nice and easy. So I'm going to start over here past my shape. And then I'm not going straight up. I'm going to lean back a little bit so the blade can cut. And I'm going to take it nice and easy and go through that path and try to keep that blade perpendicular to the surface. This does take some practice. Okay, nice and easy. So now I'm going to go a little bit faster because I have that path that I have created to follow. Still trying to keep that nice and straight. Okay, so I'm going past so I don't get those little pieces of paper stuck on the back. So this actually looks really good. This is nice and clean. A little bit of an angle. So that turned out really nicely. So with these, I'm going to transfer that line work over. So here's a complete oval. We have to go all the way around, nice and clean. So I'm going to start right in here on this larger part of the curve. Okay, so now I'm on my second pass. Trying to keep that blade straight up. So I can kind of feel and hear how the cut is working. Okay, so that's not bad. It's nice and clean. All right, so with these two parts, I want to know, this is going to be the oval that works with the closure, that makes this closure part. So I'm going to hang on to these center lines so I know when I assemble this, it's really nice and clean. And when I put it on my object, I can line up my center points. So we want to bring those over to the side. And I'm going to transfer that to both sides of this board. So it's nice and clean. And this one, we need to know the center line here. I'm just going to transfer that to the back. So by taking the time to do this, we're going to go inside of the closure. So I'm going to do the same approach that I did with the other ones. I'm going to cut these, this axis first. And this is the little space where the foam core is going to go. So this one I'm going to keep in its entirety, but I just have my center line. So we're just going to cut these two ends. Okay, not bad. Those are pretty clean. A little bit of an angle. So this is the center point. These are going to get glued to here, to that center. So I want to know where that center point is on this cross piece. So let's bring that piece of information over. I don't necessarily need the line, but actually let's bring it in just in case. These parts are getting kind of small, so we have to make them as accurate as we can. Okay, so we can remove the paper on this. And the reason I'm removing the paper is because when I glue these together, it might start to separate because it's only held on with that spray mount. Okay, so these will ultimately be glued in here on that disc. So let's put that with the two discs, and we're going to start off with these parts here. We're going to start to glue this together. So I'm going to start off by gluing this former. So here's where these center lines come in handy. I want to make sure that that is exactly on the center. And I'm going to bring this part of the foam around and glue that to there. So I just want to check my distance. I have the inside edge lining up with that former here. So the material is actually protruding a little bit. So we're going to sand that down a little bit on the outside because it is creating a little bit of an angle and it's going to be a void there. So if we sand that down a little bit, we'll have a little bit more of a surface area to glue the cardboard on the outside when we put that on there. So I'm just checking that. So sometimes these are a little off, but this is pretty clean because I had made this already. So I checked everything. So it's pretty easy for all of us to execute this. So that lines up pretty well. So we can check the center former here and see how this one looks. Gets a little, that's not bad. That's good. Sticking out slightly, but I think would be okay in there. That's good. Okay, so those are ready to go. So what we're going to do is I'm going to take this tape and I'm going to use that to hold this when I bring it around and glue that. So what I try to do is set the tape up so it's ready to go. So we're going to put that in these locations underneath here. Stick that to the bottom. And then I'm going to bring that up and tape that to that center former to hold that. So we'll do this. We have 6 locations, 3 per side. I usually set these pieces of tape up so I have them ready to go because sometimes I'm in the middle of gluing and I don't want to take the time to be tearing the tape up. So by setting this up, we're ready to go. So I'm going to do this one at a time. I'm going to glue this former in, and then I'm going to glue our other pieces in here one at a time and build this up. Sometimes I glue all these formers together and then put them into the part. That's a bit challenging. So I think this will be a little bit of an easier process for us to work on. So we'll use the Elmer's glue. These joints we're not going to see. They're all on the inside. So if it's a little sloppy or it's a little bit too much glue, it's okay. But something like that is probably going to work out really well. The critical part is getting this into position. So I'm going to make sure that I have my center point right on the middle, and I'm trying to stay in the center of that line. So So I'm going to, this isn't, make sure this is going to line up. Yeah, looks good. Okay, so I'm going to bring that center point right up to the middle of the foam core, and I'm going to bring my tape around and I'm going to tape it to the side of that former and pull that in pretty tight, but we don't want to deform the foam, the edge of the foam. I'll show you what I mean by that. So we're going to hold that right there. So now we check, we have a nice bond in here and in here. The glue is oozing out a little bit, that's fine. We're not going to be able to see that, that'll be fine. If I pull the tape too tight, I'll start to squish the foam here. So we want to pull it just enough so it's nice and clean and it's firm in there. So that takes a little bit of a touch. And we want to make sure that this is holding nice and tight. So that's the beginning of the process. And now we have these other pieces. This is the square piece. I'm going to glue that in here. So that should be a little bit away from the center because I need to have room for this piece of board to come in here. And I'm just checking this top here. It looks pretty good. Now, since I said these are square, we could check both of them. That's a little bit high. So I'm going to pick my best one. And I think this feels really good right here. So we want to glue that right into position. Here's where the center lines come in, very important. We want to make sure that's right on center and it's down on the bottom. So we're going to add glue to these two. So I'm picking this up the way I checked it, and I know I'm going to put glue on these two surfaces. That's slightly high. I'm just going to trim a very, very small amount here. Actually, there's a little bit of a bevel cut, so I'm just going to take a small amount out there. We can also sand that later. Okay, so this is our last part of the former. Okay. So that's it. Like I said, there's no resistance on that. That's just sort of a passive part. So that's sitting in there. Okay, so that's the beginning of this whole structure. So we're going to let this dry, and then I'm going to glue this other part on the other half here all at once and get that to line up. So if this is done nice and accurately, this piece will fit perfect on there. So it's going to move over to this other part, which is the closure. Same kind of process. We are going to use these as our centers and glue these into position. So this one goes through the center. Just checking, make sure I'm nice and lined up. Center line's a little off in the middle. So I'm using my fingers here to make sure that this is nice and centered. So you can see my little center line is off here slightly. But let's keep that in mind when I glue these other parts on. So these are going to glue in here. And we can see that sticking out quite a bit. Let's check that one on this side. So this one looks like that would fit. Okay, so I'm going to use that on this side. So something is slightly off, but it's okay. We can make compensations as we go. Trying to get that to stay. We want that to be as perpendicular as we can. But when I glue this into position, it has a slight angle on there. I'm going to trim that just slightly. So I have a nice surface there to glue that on. So let's check that again. Okay, that looks good this way. So I'm going to hold it like this. Keeping that on center. Okay, so I'm just going to eye this up, make sure this is pretty clean. Everything looks nice and perpendicular. Press that down. And then we're just going to finish this off on the top here with this piece. Then we might sand it, clean it up a little bit, and we're just going to wrap this with a piece of cardboard and make that nice clean shape. So here I'm just looking at my centers to the best I can, get that all to line up. Checking with my fingers that those parts are lined up. So I'm just going to press that, hold that down for a second. And then this part should be ready to go. Visual check. So again, the glue is oozing out a little bit, but that's on the inside. We're not going to see that. That'll actually help to make those bonds hold really well. Okay, so we'll let that dry. Okay, so this, I'm going to let this dry a little bit more, and then we'll continue. Like I said, we'll glue this part on the other side, and then we'll let that dry on that area. Okay, so this is dry now, so we can remove the tape. I took some of these pieces off. I just want to show, removing this tape, we need to be careful. We don't want to damage the material. So what I try to do, if we pull the tape off this way, we might lift up that edge. So what I try to do is pull it away from the edge so it doesn't tear that part. Now inside here, it's a little less critical because we're not going to see that. But I like to keep that nice and clean here. Okay, so this looks like it's ready to go. So we have all our formers in here. Everything is lined up nicely. And I have my center points here as reference. So when this is all done, it's going to be a very organic shape. So we need to know where the closure is going to go. Okay, so let's go back to this part. So this is ready to go. So I'm just going to check all my little edges here and see. This actually came out pretty good, but I just want to talk about sanding a little bit. So this is a sanding tube that I had made. It's just a shipping tube with the plastic end caps, and I glued some sandpaper on the outside. I have, there are different grits, so I have 150 and 80. 80 is a pretty rough grit, and the 150 is a little finer. So I use this for sanding negative curves, predominantly for foam, sculpting foam, but sometimes it comes in handy to clean up some of the edges on a foam core model. And then I have a block of wood, a sanding block on the inside with the same kind of sandpaper, the 80 and the 150. So sometimes if these don't quite line up and things might be a little crooked, we can kind of clean up some of these edges. It doesn't take a lot because this is only foam and paper. But sometimes if these edges don't quite line up or they're a little crooked, we can sand them to get them nice and even. So when we wrap the board on here, it'll be really clean. So this actually turned out really nicely, but if yours is slightly off, we can kind of clean that up. Not too much. We don't want to make a real severe angle because that will make the part really crooked. But try to sand and just keep them clean and perpendicular so everything lines up nicely. And sometimes if the curve has like a little bump in it from when we cut it, we can just sort of clean that up a little and make it nice. So that's just a heads up in case it's a little crooked. So we're gonna, I have this piece of board already cut. I have my center point and I trimmed one edge. So I'm just gonna double check this. We're gonna glue this to the center point here and I'm gonna line it up with this top edge. But I have extra material at the bottom here and we're gonna use that and we're gonna sand that to compensate for this curve in here. So this is hollow in here and I have my piece of foam board down here. So we're gonna sand that curve and get that to fit nice and tight in the bottom of that bottle. So that's why I have extra material on that side. So let me just check. Again, this board, it's a SBS board. We could use Bristol board, and there's a couple of other poster boards that are also work pretty well. This is pretty thick. This is about, I think this is 18 point, and it works really well for these curves. Like sometimes if we have tiny little radiuses or smaller curves, I would use a thinner board. thicker, the better, because it keeps from seeing the internal structure. But it really depends on what your curves are. So we are going to line this up in the middle of that. I'm going to come around to the front. So there's my center point lining up. And I'm going to come around to the back and just double check this. And I'm going to make a little mark right here. I'm going to trim this part down. So that's hopefully accurate. Move that over just a little. And keep that nice and square. It's helpful to have a triangle for these little square cuts. If not, you could do 2 measurements to make sure that lines up. So again, I'm just going to make another check. See if this comes all the way around. And that looks pretty good. It's slightly off because my oval might not be perfect, but it's not bad. I'll push that into position. Okay, so that looks ready to go. I have a piece of tape that I might use to hold that together. So what we'll do is now this glue joint we're going to see, so I don't want to use too much because it will ooze out. And on the top of the closure, on the end of the closure, we're going to see this joint. So I want to try to keep this as clean as possible. So not too much. And we're going to put some glue on this one seam because that's where the part's going to start and stop. You could put them on these other ones, but it's really not that necessary. So some things I do like to do, especially when this is a really clean joint, I might even spread that glue out a little. Get that all over that entire surface. So we can get like 100% coverage on that. So that's why I use these little paper towel things, keep my hands clean. And then we're going to start on the back here where I have the glue. I'm going to do my best to not put my finger in the glue. It's a little hard, but I want to hold it on the middle of that edge, just halfway. It's going to hold that down, and I'm going to wrap this around, keeping it tight to that top edge. And bringing that right around to the back and pulling that in, keeping this nice and clean. So I'm a little crooked there, so I'm going to pull on that bottom just to bring that in nice and tight and get those to sit right next to one another. So that looks pretty good. Nice tight seam there. So this is where I might just put a piece of tape in here, keep this clean. And there we are. So that's really nice. Lines up at the top. And I have that extra material that we will sand and clean that out to get that to line up. Okay, so that's ready to go. This part's ready. We have our other piece here. Again, might want to flex it a little bit and get that to want to bend. But we're going to use tape to hold that into position. So again, I'm just going to see how this fits. So I have my center points. I'm going to line that right up with that top rib there and see how it looks down here. So that looks nice. And I'm just flexing that over so the flex isn't resisting too much, which is good. And that looks like that should line up nicely. Okay, so I'm going to glue this into position and I'm going to use tape to hold this together. So again, I'm going to set up my tape in these locations. Again, it'll be the same 6 locations. So when I put that piece in, all I have to do is bring the tape in to the other side, and that'll hold that into position. Okay, so those will hold. I'm gonna put that down. So on the tops of these edges, again, these glue joints we're not going to see, they're all internal. So we don't have to worry about putting too much. Put enough on there. And the more glue you use, the longer it takes to dry. So it's a little bit of a judgment call. Okay, so I'm going to put that on center there and put it on center on the bottom, and then check with my fingers that there's no extra space. And take a look. Okay, so I'm going to flex this around and see my spacing is a little off here. So I'm just going to move that over slightly. So my center will be off a little bit. But I'm really looking at this little joint right in here to see how that's going to fit. So I'm just going to bring this tape right around to the other side. Pull it enough, like I mentioned before, not squeezing the foam, but holding it enough so we get nice connection there. That looks pretty good. So now this is slightly off here, so I'm going to flex this over and just hold that. So that's probably a little bit crooked. So I'm not sure if this part was crooked or my little center mark was off. Just slightly off. It's not, again, it's not as critical. Now I'm going to check the center on this. I'm just going to move that over just a hair. Okay, not bad. Pulling that tape in. And pulling that in. And that's slightly off there. Not bad. Okay, I'm just checking the contact there. That's really important. Now we have this one in the center. So this is a shorter distance. So this might need to be pulled a little bit tighter. It's actually coming in really nicely without any tape there, but we'll just make sure that that's locked in there. Again, I don't want to squish the foam too much with the tape, just enough to hold that into position. So these curved surfaces are really, really nice. All right, so we have both sides glued on, and they're up against the formers here, so it's nice and tight. And these look really good. So now we're just going to take a look at this edge. So as we can see, as the board comes around, we have this edge sticking out, this little corner here. So when we wrap our cardboard on here, it's going to come straight across. So the contact point is going to be very minimal. So what I'm going to do is just slightly sand that little corner off. Up at the top, we're in pretty good shape because that goes straight across. But as we come down around these curves, we don't have a lot of surface area to glue to. So I'm just going to sand that just a little bit to give us some surface and just to kind of even up some of the edges. So that's where this tube will come in handy for the negative curves in here. And then we'll do the positive curves with the other part. So I'm just going to touch this up a little bit to take off a little bit of that corner. Now I have my little center rib here sticking up a little bit. So I'm just going to kind of sand that down a little also. Just kind of take off that edge just a little bit. So I'm just bringing that edge back and also kind of cleaning up this curve in case it's a little bit crooked. It'll give us a little bit more area to glue to. A piece of cardboard, pre-cut. It's just a rectangular piece. It's longer than what I need. I mean, one way to estimate it, I just sort of rolled the piece on here and came around and just added some extra for the negative curves. So that's just an estimate. I did cut this width here and I added a little extra because the chances of this thing wrapping around here perfectly is probably very unlikely because subtle things are going to be off here and there. So I add a little extra material. So if it comes around and it's crooked, it'll still cover. So let's hope that's going to work. So I do have my center marks here on both sides. I'm going to use that as a guide. I put a center line here on the cardboard on the outside and on the inside. And I'm going to use that as a guide to glue this into position. So I'm going to glue this in stages. I'm going to test it here. So I'm going to put glue on this outside surface, and I'm only going to bring it up to the side here. And we'll do this in stages. So I'm going to bring this piece up, and I'm going to hold that in there. I'm going to bring this piece up and hold that. And then we need to check. I'll do this with the glue in position. But let's just take a look here. And I'm going to hold it with my hand. We can squeeze in this negative area here, but I kind of want to check that it's pretty square. I don't want to go off center too much. Whoops, it looks like that might work pretty well. So what we need to do is check. So it's pretty good. If that fits. So again, I'm going to bring glue on these edges just to this area right here. And then we'll add glue in there later and do that other part. Oops, glue dried. All right, so I'm going to rub this out with my finger. So I'm actually putting a little bit too much on there. I don't want it to ooze out to the front too much. Let's just spread that out a little. Okay. Get one of these ready. All right, so I have quite a bit of glue on there, so I'm going to spread that out. I can get it to go to the inside, but I don't want it on the front surface. So we want to keep that as clean as possible, because that's the edge that we're going to see. Okay, I'm just going to use a paper towel here and keep the glue off of this front surface as much as possible. Okay. Okay. So now we want to put this, actually I'm going to put some glue right here. That's sort of my center rib. And I want to put that right on center. So, as clean as I can. I don't have any glue here, so I can actually hold this like this. I'm going to bring this in. Bring this in. And then see, this is quite a bit off here. I don't want it to be so far off. I'm talking about centering it on the part. Okay, I'm making sure I have as much contact as possible. Okay, I'm a little crooked there, but I want to make sure that this is holding. Okay, so we can just hold this by hand. check all our areas in here, make sure we're getting contact. We could put some tape, again, to pull that in. But I kind of want to watch this by hand. I'm going to make some marks here, and we're going to trim that right to that center. So let's bring that mark to the top. Actually, I probably want to bring that to the inside so I can get my straight edge in here. Okay, so I'm just going to trim that part off. And let me see if I'm square. So it's slightly off square because that pulled around kind of crooked. So I need to follow my center marks and ignore that square section because that's slightly crooked, but it's lining up. So I can take a little bit more off. Just take a 30 thousandths. Actually, go a little more. I want to get that to overlap that foam core rib at the bottom. Okay, so that's overlapping halfway. And just checking the rest of my seams here. That's holding in nice. Excellent. So that will go there. And then this one will overlap it. You can see how they're not lining up. That's why I have that extra material. So we could do these both at the same time or one at a time. Depends on what you're comfortable doing. So I'm going to try to do both of these at the same time. I could do one at a time. I think I'll bring them both in. So I'm just going to pull this material back a little and get the glue in here. Like this. And we'll pull this back a little. Like so. And I think I'll smooth that out. Okay, and then we definitely need glue on the center rib here. All right, so I'm going to bring these around. Pull that in. And I'm going to check my connections here. Okay, that looks good. A little bit of a space there, but it's not too bad. So I think here I will pull some tape in. Get that to hold. Like so. And I'm just checking. So I have a little bit of glue oozing in there. So I'm going to try to get that out of there. Might be able to use a little piece of cardboard. Okay, that looks good. So now we're back to the closure. This is dry by now, so we can remove this piece of tape. Again, be careful over the edges here. We don't want to pull up the cardboard. Keep that as clean as possible. So like I mentioned, ultimately this part is going to fit on this curve. So what we have to do is we have to remove some material in here. We could do it a couple ways. We could cut a little bit. What's going to happen is it's going to be a negative curve this way. It's going to come all the way down to the surface of this foam core, and it's going to come up to this high edge here. I measured it so I know where that edge is. So what we have to do is get this curve here and here. A couple ways to do it. We could just take this and start sanding and going. It'll take a little bit longer. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut some of this material out of here. Just kind of random and by hand. So I don't have to sand all that. It's sort of like a rough cut just to get it started. So I'm just kind of scooping that out of there. Not too much. I don't want to go too far, but I want to just cut some of this out so I don't have to sand all that material out of there. So this is just a little bit of by eye. So I'm going to sand, and I want to keep this perpendicular to this. I don't want to turn it this way or that way. I'm going to try to follow this center line. So if we just do a little bit at a time and shift our position, we should be able to get that. So I'm just going to start sanding right in the middle. So I know right here in the center, we're going to come all the way down to that foam core. So we can take a look as we go. I'm going to go on this side now, trying to stay perpendicular. I might have cut. Let's take a look. So it's pretty good. So I cut a little bit too much, so I have a little bit of a gap there. So I'll try to blend that, get that to fit. Seeing how this is square, or not square. It's a little bit of a gap here. I cut a little too much. So let's see if I can get that to fit. I have a little bit more space down here. So I sanded the line off, my center line there. Try to get that down as much as possible. I'm slightly off there. Not too bad. Oops. So I'm actually going to remove some of that material in the center there so I can get this to sit down a little better. Okay, let's see how this looks. Okay, so I have a little bit of a gap there. Not too bad. Okay, I think that'll be the best I can get. I cut a little too much. I think I might just squeeze this down when I glue it on there and get that to sit as best I can. All right, so this is dry on here now. So we can remove the tape, and we're going to trim that excess material. And then we're just about done. Okay, so I'm going to use the blade to trim this, but I'm going to be really careful. I do not want to damage this surface here. So I'm going to trim this along this edge and leaving some extra. I'm not going to try to make it perfect because I've tried that so many times and I always damage it in one way or another. So I'm just going to pull this in, and I'm actually going to cut high on the blade here, and I'm just going to pull towards my thumb nice and easy, and try not to get too close to the edge so I don't damage that surface. So I'm leaning the blade in this way and cutting from that side. Okay. so we're almost there. So it's just a matter of, I mean, we can get in there and you can trim it a little bit closer, but I always get quite nervous trying to do that. So I'm going to sand, use both of these tools. So in sanding, we do not want to damage this top material. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sand just slightly off of that on an angle, just slightly, and sand the cardboard to that edge so I don't damage this surface on here. It can be really quite nice. So it's just a matter of doing this whole part. It takes a little time. That's not bad. I'm just going to get rid of this little flashing. Okay, it's nice. So do the same process on the other side, and then we'll glue the bottom on. Okay, so this looks good. Get rid of some of that little flashing on the end. So I think we're in pretty good shape. So that's nice. So what we have to do is put the closure on. This is when we started this sculpt. So my little bottom here, you know, I got a little bit of an edge there, so it's crooked. So I went back and just sort of sanded this a little bit. I actually sanded right through the foam core in the middle there. Just sort of get that to fit as tight as possible. And the idea is we're going to glue this on here, and we want to try as best we can to get that seam to line up. So it's a little difficult, and I'm going back and forth here to see which way it fits the best, and kind of, you know, checking it from the top view and see how that's going to look. All right, so I think we'll try it like this. Okay, so when this glues on here, the only part that's going to touch the top of the bottle shape is right here in the center. So we don't need glue here. We don't even need to glue this edge. This is just going to be like a little shroud that sits there. So we only need the glue here in the middle, and then that's what's going to hold that on. So I'm putting it on this way. So I'm just going to put some glue right in that center. I don't want to make it ooze out to the side, so I'm just going to put a little bit right up to the paper on both sides like that, and then that should be fine. So I'm just going to kind of eye this. I'm looking at the center marks on the bottle shape. Just kind of eyeing it in the middle. And then sort of take a look at it this way too to see if it's perpendicular as best I can. I'm just going to press that down a little, get that to hold. Just keep checking it from all sides. Looks good. So the seam is not bad. A little bit of a seam there. I mean, the reality of this, there would be a bottle and the protrusion where the opening is, they call that the finish where the thread pattern is. So quite often there'll be a finish that maybe comes up into the closure, or maybe the finish is part of this and there might be a seam here where the closure is. There's a couple of different ways that could be detailed, but I'm not getting involved with that right now. I just want to take a look at this shape and see how it looks and it feels and check the proportions of that. So that's part of this exercise, is to explore these designs dimensionally. Because we've done it maybe in a 3D file, we've done sketches of these. So it's always nice to see these shapes come to life. And this is just one of the techniques to do that. So I'm just going to stand this up. I know you're looking down on the top of it. I'm just going to check with my triangle and see how square I am. So it's not bad. That lines up pretty square on both sides this way. And then I'm going to check the front area too. Okay, that's a little crooked. I'm a little off there. All right, so I'm just going to kind of push this a little bit. Just squeeze it over slightly to get that to sit a little bit better. It's not absolutely critical, but it would be nice if it was perfectly square. Okay, that helped. I just sort of pushed it over there a little bit, squeeze it on there. Okay, so that looks good. So that's the conclusion of this. I'm gonna let that dry. Maybe we could mock up a label, because this whole front surface is a ruled surface, which means we can put a PSL, a pressure sensitive label on that. We could, if this was a compound curve and I had other curves in different directions, this bottle could have a shrink label on it. But I wanted to keep track of this ruled surface, and plus it is foam core and cardboard, we are working with these ruled surfaces on both sides. Okay, that's it.